Tonight on Primetime Politics, securing the Arctic.
We cannot and should not look first to others to defend our nation.
Prime Minister Mark Carney announces billions of dollars for Canada's north, money for defense and communities as the country's sovereignty comes under attack. What will the impact of those dollars be? We will examine the issue. This is Primetime Politics. Hello, I'm Michael Serapio. Well, the federal government is investing billions of dollars in Canada's north. Announced today by Prime Minister Mark Carney in Iqaluit, the money includes $6 billion to develop, along with Australia, over-the-horizon radar technology. $420 million to bolster Canadian forces in the Arctic. That includes training exercises and the deployment of armed forces personnel. Plus over $253 million to invest in housing and energy infrastructure.
The announcements today will strengthen Arctic security. They'll bolster our partnerships with our closest allies. They'll build the North's economic potential and advance reconciliation with the Inuit, with First Nations and Métis. Canada is and will forever be an Arctic nation. As the Premier just said, this is the true North, strong and free, and Canada is strong, united, and sovereign.
Now, of course, all this funding is coming while Carney is in his first week in office and amid threats from the U.S. president to annex Canada. Joining us right now is Senator Tony Dean, from December 2021 to November of 2024. He chaired the Senate Committee on National Security, Defense and Veterans Affairs. And in 2023, that committee released a report on Arctic security. Senator Dean, thank you for joining us.
You're very welcome. Good to be here.
So listen, you and I spoke in 2023 when the Senate issued that report, the committee that you chaired. And in that report, you talked about why the over-horizon radar is needed. And here you now have Prime Minister Carney dedicating billions of dollars to its development. Why is it so important when it comes to Arctic sovereignty?
Well, first of all, we know the scale and scope of Canada's Arctic. 40% of its land mass, 75% of its coastline, less than 1% of its population. Directly to the north is Russia's Arctic. And for a decade or two, Russia has been developing its landing strips, its submarine facilities. It has nuclear-powered submarine station there, missiles. And so we have a very empowered Russia in its part of the Arctic. We know that the threat from that weaponry comes south, likely through Canada to the US. We've seen in the last several years the development of a whole new class of missiles, hypersonic and hyperkinetic, which have a much shorter journey time south. It means that our response time in monitoring those missiles and intercepting them has been shortened. So the more we go north with interceptors and tracking capacity, the more response time we have. Yeah. And that's what is planned with this Canada-Australia ground-based monitoring system.
And it is a co-venture, as you say. And when you say over the horizon, we're talking about going over the curvature of the Earth. But you mentioned Russia, but in addition to Russia, we also know China has ambitions when it comes to the Arctic. And all that was true when you and I spoke a couple of years ago. But you've now add onto it, Donald Trump, who's making these comments about annexing Canada. How do you view the United States vis-a-vis the North? Because on the one hand, we work with them when it comes to NORAD. On another, we have an American president who does not seem to respect Canadian sovereignty.
Well, NORAD will be 67 years old this May, and an anniversary will be celebrated, we hope. We hope to make it to the 67th year. Right now, as we would expect, NORAD's aircraft are in the air. Its defensive systems are on full alert, and Canada and the US jointly operate in command NORAD headquarters in Colorado Springs seamlessly. That command shifts from US to Canadian and back again. We hope it stays that way. But in the context of the current geopolitical situation, this is what you're leading us into. The US and its president is looking around at who it wants to partner with and who it wants its friends to be. And it certainly is becoming closer to Russia, and there seems to be some sort of closeness between President Putin and President Trump. But we have to worry about that. And we have to start thinking about developing our own capacity, Michael, and partnering with other suppliers of defence architecture. I think that's what's important about Australia. I think that's what's important about the Prime Minister's first meetings with heads of state in France and the UK, and his trip to the north today. We will likely have to diversify in terms of our defence infrastructure and look to partner potentially with other allies, particularly, obviously, NATO allies.
You know, going back to your report again, you talked about how the Arctic was at this inflection point. And today we now have this multi-billion-dollar investment in defense. We're also seeing hundreds of millions of dollars invested in energy infrastructure as
Yes.
well as housing. You know, I don't have a lot of time left, but does that encourage you that we are meeting the needs of this inflection point, or is there still more that you want to see done?
I'm reminded that $420 million is going to go into northern defence operations. There will be a greater permanent presence of our forces in the north, which is welcomed actually by our northern neighbours. They are interested. What we heard from people living on the land, right across the north, and from northern leaders, is that they would like to see defence investments paralleled by community investments. And we're seeing today investments in hydroelectric power, clean energy, in housing infrastructure, and likely the co-location in the far north of a permanent military presence supported by local peoples. And that combination of defence investment and social infrastructure investment is exactly what we heard from northern leaders as we crossed the Arctic.
So here we are, almost 2 years since your report. You're happy to see many of your recommendations coming into play now?
I am delighted, and I know that my colleagues on the Defence Committee would be also.
Senator Tony Dean, thank you for this. Appreciate the time.
Thanks very much, Michael.
Well, staying in Iqaluit right now, while in Nunavut, the Prime Minister was asked once again about financial assets that he put into a blind trust. Now, Carney has not publicly disclosed what his assets were before going into that trust, but Conservatives want to know, especially before Canadians go to the polls. And take a listen to what we heard from Prime Minister Carney today about the matter.
I'm working as fast as I can. Recall that and I didn't set these rules. They were set by a government of which Mr. Paquet was a member, that the time horizon is measured in months. I worked in advance, actually, of becoming Prime Minister in terms of the disposals, and in a matter of days and weeks in terms of having these screens.
So again, that was the Prime Minister in Iqaluit. Take a listen now to what we heard from Conservatives right here in Ottawa.
This so-called blind trust of his, it doesn't protect him. Why? Because these aren't stocks or ETFs like normal Canadians have that a trustee can buy and sell freely. No, he raised the money from international billionaires and made the investments. He knows exactly what is in there. And those Brookfield funds are locked in with long-term contracts. The only people blind to Carney's assets and conflicts are Canadians, because he refuses to tell them the truth.
Well, let's get into these questions being asked of Prime Minister Carney. Michele Cadario is the CEO of Vanguard Strategy, former national campaign director for the Liberals, Cheryl Oates, principal at GT, and most recently was the campaign director for the Saskatchewan NDP. Jordan Paquet, vice president of Blue Sky Strategy Group, deputy campaign manager for the PEI-PC party in the last provincial campaign. A lot of PPPs in there. Hello to the three of you. Thank you for joining us.
Happy to be here.
So listen, let's begin with these questions surrounding the Prime Minister. How much of a liability will these assets be for Prime Minister Carney, especially if, as we seem to have seen now, he is very uncomfortable answering the questions, in fact, even getting defensive? How much of a liability is that going to be, Michele?
Well, I don't think the fact of the assets is a liability at all. I think, certainly I worked for a prime minister who was very transparent, putting everything into a blind trust, who was quite wealthy. But what is more concerning, and it's really just more of a rookie mistake, is his response to it. This is the first time that he's actually been asked, now that he's now entered political life, about his personal assets in public, I'm sure, right? It's not something that is dinner table conversation, but it is something that's part of the political discourse. And so I think that, he was bristly, and that's not all that becoming in somebody that wants to be your prime minister. So he's a quick learner. He's a very smart man. I think that he will learn from that error in terms of how to approach and how to react to questions that you might not be super comfortable with. He's got his assets in using the process. It's a weird and compressed timeline. And so I would suspect that, he's going to continue to be asked about this. And so, the information will be forthcoming. There's no doubt in my mind that he's not in this for his own personal gain or anything like that. He could make a whole lot more money outside of politics, but he's now prime minister, and he's now being expected to answer questions about his wealth.
Okay, so Jordan, what do you say? It's to what we heard from Michele, not the assets, more how he's responding to the question.
Well, it could be a bit of both, but absolutely the fact that he is not prepared or hasn't been prepped to go out and answer this with any confidence. You're right, he bristles at journalist questions. Yesterday he got quite condescending with some of them. If he continues to get frustrated, it's going to continue to knock the Liberals off message. And that's going to be a big problem for them heading into what is expected to be a very short campaign on the shorter ends of it. So if he's trying to be out there putting out his vision for where he wants to take the country, and every other question is going to still be about these ethical disclosures of his financial assets, and he can't come up with a more confident answer than he has so far. They've been asking him this since the launch of the leadership campaign, when he officially launched it in Edmonton. It's come up a couple times since, and you better believe it's going to come up on the debate stage, where Pierre Poilievre and potentially the other leaders will be pressing him extremely hard too. So it's one thing to answer it in English. How is he going to also do it in French in Quebec, and doing it in a way that's going to come off sounding confident from him?
Yeah, Cheryl, what's your assessment of this issue and how Mark Carney is responding to it?
Yeah, I agree. He didn't answer the questions well. But like Michele said, that's something that, usually if you are holding the chair that Mark Carney is now currently holding, you don't make that mistake twice. There are people around you, coaching you, helping you, giving you feedback on how to do it again, and I doubt that he makes the same mistake twice. When it comes down to what this means in terms of the election, I really doubt that how Mark Carney answers this question in French is going to be vote deciding for most people. I think that the public is looking at who is the best person to take on Donald Trump, who is the best person to manage Canada's economy through this crisis. And although some of these questions are questions that should be asked, I'm not sure that the general public, this will really stick in terms of being vote determining for people, whether Mark Carney is a good fit for this position or not.
I think it comes down to a matter of trust, though, too. And that's if they he's just new onto the national scene here. Well, sorry, new into the political scene here. People know his name before, but they don't really know everything about him. So if Conservatives and if opposition parties can distill some level of distrust in Mark Carney and have a bit of that cloud of suspicion, Canadians may think twice before going to the polls.
Okay, but is this an exercise?
I'm sure,
sorry, go ahead, Cheryl.
I was going to say, I'm sure that is what the Conservatives are hoping for. That is why they keep pushing this issue. They've been harping on the carbon tax for 2 years now, making progress on it, and now they don't have the carbon tax to campaign on, and so they're looking for something new. And to me, this seems like a bit of a stretch.
Yeah, well, you know, and to that, Jordan, you know, is it just about trying to embarrass Mark Carney, so seeds of distrust in his personality, or do Conservatives actually have an issue with the assets? Because they have been put into a blind trust, so how is that an issue?
Sure, but I mean, I don't think it could be believable, fine, blind trust aside. Still, it's the way he's going to come out and answer it. And I still don't think a lot of Canadians would believe that he was just the managing chair of Brookfield Assets, that he wouldn't know where most of these investments are currently made. It's not like as soon as they go into a blind trust, oh, boom, he forgets every single place that they are. So these are questions that certainly deserve to be asked. Again, there may be like absolutely nothing nefarious about it, but it's a way how he answers the question and how he presents it.
Okay, so what you're asking for is what, just greater transparency
Greater
to break
transparency.
down
I think
what's
that would
actually in blind
that would do a
trust?
lot of work for him as well, to just to be more transparent about this.
Michelle, what do you make of that then? Like, I mean,
Well, I'm just going to say the other lesson that has to be learned. Certainly, his response was poor, and he needs to do better. But he's now also learned that when you make a mistake on the campaign trail, you lose a day. And so, you know, he was having a terrific kind of outing. He had his first visit to France and to the UK as Prime Minister, first international outing. He was on the international stage with allies, and he had a message to deliver. And now, what are we talking about today? Nothing to do with what happened over there, or his Arctic announcement or whatever that is today. We're talking about how he responded to a question about his assets. And so that lesson is a good one to learn now, because a day in the campaign is very valuable. And so you can't be continuing to do that.
But
again,
are the assets a problem? Is it enough to be put into a blind trust? Is there another issue beyond that?
Well, I believe absolutely. That's how we've always operated. That's how every prime minister, every cabinet minister of both parties has ever operated. You put it into a blind trust. You have a trustee, and that you will exempt yourself from decisions that are determined to be a potential conflict of interest. Any person with any character, and Mark Carney is someone with great character, is absolutely going to go to the mat to make sure that he is in no way subject to any kind of conflict of interest or perceived conflict of interest. And so I have no question that he is going to be able to do that. And I have experience working with a prime minister who had to, you know, go about putting all of his assets into a blind trust and, you know, operating just fine with that because he had the Canadian interests at heart. And I firmly believe that all leaders of parties do.
Sorry, Cheryl, I'm going to cut you off a little bit, Michelle, running out of time. What do you think? Is it enough to have put the assets in blind trust and no longer an issue, and this is mainly like a tempest in the teapot for Conservatives?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Michelle. I think that there's protocol to be followed, there's precedent to be followed, and so far Mark Carney has exceeded what the rules ask him to do. I think what this really comes down to is, do Canadians believe that Mark Carney will act in the interest of Canadians or act in his own personal interest? And if they don't, they won't vote for him in this coming election. I also think that if he truly was just concerned about continuing to make more money for himself, why would he have left his private sector positions and taken this job at this particular moment? So maybe there's questions, but those questions will be answered when Canadians get their chance to vote.
Okay, well, that is the time. Michelle, Cheryl, Jordan, thank you for it. Well, let's turn now to the matter of Ukraine, because today the U.S. and Russian presidents did have a phone call in which the two countries agreed to an immediate but limited ceasefire, which is much less than what the Ukrainian president agreed to last week when he met with U.S. officials in Saudi Arabia. Still, this is what Donald Trump put out on social media. Take a look. The highlighted portion, he writes, "We agreed to an immediate ceasefire on all energy and infrastructure with an understanding that we will be working quickly to have a complete ceasefire and ultimately an end to this very horrible war between Russia and Ukraine." Now, we should note that Ukraine did not have a representative on today's phone call. And to talk about this, we're now joined by Ihor Michalchyshyn, CEO and Executive Director of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress. Ihor, thank you for making the time again for us.
Thank you, Michael.
Listen, I think it's important to remind people that the Ukrainian president did agree to a full ceasefire last week when he was having his talks with U.S. officials. But this is not that. This is a limited ceasefire on energy and infrastructure, which we said earlier. Is that concerning in any way that this is only partially applied, not fully applied as a ceasefire?
Well, I think it's part of Vladimir Putin's not being able to say yes to an unconditional ceasefire. So instead, he's dragging it out. He's adding all sorts of conditions that we've seen in previous years about Ukraine and its armament and mobilization. So it's very clear that Putin isn't going to agree to the ceasefire that the Americans proposed, to Ukraine and then have taken to him. It's unfortunate that this is going to be manipulated. It's very confusing to even understand what the terms of this are, because as I read right now as we're doing this interview, Russia is currently launching drones and missile attacks on Ukraine, across Ukraine, and including on energy infrastructure. So I'm not sure how much faith we should put into this.
Mm-hmm. How much faith you should put into that. And that's actually something that we heard from Volodymyr Zelensky as to how the world should be approaching Russia on the matter of this war. But, the Kremlin has commented on this phone call. They are reportedly saying that an end to this war should be handled bilaterally. So between Russia and the United States, not Ukraine. What's your reaction to that?
Well, I'm sure the Kremlin's very happy. They've had a very prestigious, high-level call with the President of the United States. They're normalizing their relationship and normalizing their world power here, as opposed to the isolation that's happened in the past. Putin and the Kremlin don't believe that Ukraine exists as a state. That's been the fundamental since the beginning of 2014 and then 2022, further invasion. So it's just baffling why President Trump continues to enable Putin to exert no pressure, significant pressure on them, and in this case is giving Putin and Russia what they want, which is a platform on which to discuss old grievances.
Yeah, well, and you talk about what Russia wants, and Russia is also asking that no aid nor any intelligence is shared with Ukrainians. What would that do to the defense of Ukraine if the United States actually did that?
Well, we saw that last week when there was a pause on military aid and intelligence sharing, and Ukraine was plunged into a crisis, although temporarily. While, about 30% of Ukrainian arms are produced domestically, I believe about 40% comes from the United States and its suppliers, and the rest from Europe and Canada and other countries. So it would be a major change in the way that the Ukrainian army arms itself. The intelligence sharing, the consequences of that last week were that we believe that Ukrainian anti-missile attackers couldn't figure out where the attacks were coming from. Right? They didn't have the intel, the satellite technology to know how to stop these attacks. And so us and many other organizations have said that kind of a decision by the United States really puts civilian lives in danger.
Mm-hmm. Now, Trump is conducting these talks while he's also engaging in trade wars, with countries around the world, European countries, Canada, and in that chaos, are you worried that Ukraine is getting lost as countries deal with trade issues rather than international security and European security?
Well, I think European security has been very much the top of the agenda in the past week with Macron and Starmer holding major high-level summits, but we haven't seen anything come out of that. So that's very disappointing. We don't know, what the outcome of these summits is going to be, and having just an endless series of meetings plays right into the Russian hand here. I think that, again, Putin's overall objective is to destroy Ukraine and its people, to normalize his world view of that Ukraine and many other post-Soviet republics aren't viable, aren't real, and that their people and their nations are not either. So I think that Putin is having a win. Putin's having a major dialogue with a world power, getting the prestige and the world hanging on his every step. And he's really, manipulating the situation by not saying no, but not saying yes.
Mm-hmm. Is that the message that you want Canadians to carry away from this conversation, to be aware of, that this is part of a greater strategy?
Absolutely. I think that we shouldn't be fooled by this headline that, Putin agrees to this. He says he agrees to this on a day that he's firing missiles into power plants. So we've seen what Vladimir Putin's word is worth in the past, and I don't put much value into it. We know that what he says and what he does are very different than what he's been saying to President Trump. And unfortunately, the Americans are going to go through this again, and hoping to some kind of a reset or rebuild of Russian relations will bring peace, but we are very confident that that's not the way to go here.
Now, we are about to enter a federal election campaign. I'm wondering what you're going to be looking for from the different political parties as they ask Canadians for their vote.
Well, primarily, we're looking for continued support of Ukraine and its people from a position of strength. So Canada as a major ally of Ukraine in terms of economic and military assistance. We've certainly seen that topic on NATO 2% GDP spending become something that everyone suddenly understands. And we feel that with a stronger armed forces, Canadian armed forces, Canada will have the ability to do more for Ukraine and with Ukraine. For example, one of the biggest accomplishments we've had is Operation Unifier, which is just celebrating its 10th anniversary. That's the Canadian training mission, which has trained thousands of Ukrainian soldiers and continues to do so. That's really been a critical key to Ukraine's military success.
Ihor Michalchyshyn, always appreciate the time. Thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you, Michael.
And of course, we will continue to follow this story. But that is our program for this Tuesday evening. I'm Michael Serapio. For everyone here at CPAC, thank you for watching. Primetime Politics is back tomorrow evening. Until then, take care.